Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Solid topic, let's do it. What's the creepiest thing you've seen as a child? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Saw an electrician get fried on a power pole while we were playing outside. I will never forget that sound. Didn't even know he died until I was an adult. My dad took us inside and called 911 and didn't mention it again until my brother brought it up at dinner one night. I was walking to school, and I was about 5 or 6 years old, and some guy pulled up beside me in his car and asked if I would get in. He also offered me sweets to do so. I said no. The creepy bit was when he calmly said, "Clever boy," to me, then drove off. I've never even told my parents or anyone else about this, as it would most likely freak them out. Me and my best friend would explore the drainage tunnels under the Vegas area where we grew up. These were miles long, and it was always really cool down there, so it was a good way to escape the heat of our scorching hot summers. We went into one that goes under the Fiesta Casino and found a camp with a bunch of homeless crackheads. Mind you, we're like 11 years old, and we just kept going like it was nothing. It wasn't scary, but when I look back at it, we could have been in some serious danger. Our parents had no idea we did this or where we were, and we had no cell phones. We could have been kidnapped and never been found. Home alone in our trailer house at 10 years old and saw a dark figure wearing a black cape, hat, and knee-high black boots. Saw him just as he turned around the corner. I was so scared I waited in the snow with no jacket until my mom came home from work. I was at a Portillo's once when I was 12. And I was waiting with my little brother at a booth while my parents got our food. This guy was standing with his tray kind of watching me. Then after a couple of minutes, he started to walk over really fast, not breaking eye contact with me. He was 2 feet from the table, and my dad came out of nowhere and scared the shit out of him. He looked so surprised and just said he wanted to see if I'd get scared or not. He left his tray full of food near the door and left. My folks reported him, but we never went to that location again, since we found a better one closer to home. I was a little older than a kid, freshman in college. I walked up to the elevator in my dorm. The elevator doors were open. Another student that I saw every day was between the floor and the bottom of the car. The elevator was across the middle of his back, and his legs were down in the shaft, while the car continued to try to make the last 1.5 feet to be flush with the floor. The sound was the most disturbing noise I've ever heard. You could hear his ribs and vertebrae snapping as the car was bouncing up and down. He was unconscious, but his eyes were open and rolled back in his head. Myself and 2 other students tried to pull him out. It wasn't working. I ran to the front desk to call EMS before cell phones. Another student took the stairs to the 2nd floor and tried to call the elevator to that floor. When I got back to the lobby, the elevator started for the 2nd floor. The person that stayed was unable to hold up the injured student, and the poor man fell down the elevator shaft to the basement. It took EMS another 5 minutes to get to him. I heard that he was in surgery for 20 hours and lived. I never saw him on campus again. He always wore a blue suit with white high-top sneakers. Dad's side of the family pranked me by burying a fake body in our back property and had me dig it up to find valuables. I was only allowed to use a lantern for light. They stuffed old clothes with chicken bones, sheetrock mud where the head was, random fake jewelry as the treasures. I was like maybe 10 or 11. I remember digging up the boot first and started gagging because it became real at that point. Once when I was 6, my mom had a party. Drinking, drugs, lots of people. Neighbor got out of hand rowdy and was asked to leave. Stay on his porch and waited for the next person to walk out. Me and my Uncle John were heading to the corner store and I heard the loud pop, and John fell to the ground. Police arrived first, and ambulance was hours away because very rural. Police spent an hour and a half slapping a dead man, yelling at him to wake up. Amidst all the chaos, nobody even realized that I was there. It was all very traumatic for me, watching the cops slap my uncle's dead body like that. Guy ended up only doing 5 years on a voluntary manslaughter charge. I was 7 and survived the 2004 tsunami in Thailand, witnessed a wave rise way above the already massive palm trees, approximately 40 feet, and my family and I watched and heard the wave crash into the ground from a rooftop, killing so many people instantly. I saw a lot of dead bodies on the way. I was about 6 years old. I was afraid of the dark. I had an older sister, but she wouldn't let me sleep with her anymore when I got scared, so I laid awake a lot at night. I had a window in my room, and I remember a streetlight came on. I thought that was weird because it was very late and I lived in a quiet neighborhood. This was late 70s. I got up to look out the window and I saw the craziest thing. I'll never forget it. It was a small man dressed in a jester costume. I remember the shoes with the pointy bells, and he was sneaking behind our car. It was surreal. There was a gravel pit at the end of my road where people used to go and raise hell, do drugs, etc. It was also a great place to ride bikes, which is why I went there a lot. One time, a purple Volkswagen Bug came tearing through the front of the pit where I'd stopped with some other guys. We could hear the driver revving the engine and running the VW over the trails that ran through the woods behind the pit. We had a bad feeling about it and got out of there. Next day, we found the VW overturned, smashed up, and partially burned. I told my parents about it, but I don't think they believed me. It stayed there for weeks afterwards. We threw rocks at it. Another time, there was a car parked right in the middle of one of the pit trails I was riding on. I had to pass the car really close and got off my bike to push it. As I got to the driver's side door, a man was sitting there with his head resting back. He roused and looked at me. I wasn't freaked out at all. He seemed really calm and harmless. I said hi. He said hi back. Then he asked, "Do you brush your teeth?" And I said yes. He smiled, showing that he was missing all of his front teeth up and down. And he said, "Good, I don't." Looking back, it was clear the guy was parked there getting high. It was really sad and I felt bad for the guy, even as a little kid. I don't know why my parents let 6 to 10-year-old kids over there. My family was vacationing in Florida when I was about 5 or 6 years old. At one point we went to a grocery store to grab some supplies, and I asked my mom if I could go to the cereal aisle, the next one over from where we were, and she said yes. So I went over and almost immediately some bald guy with a leather jacket started walking over to me and said, "Your mom just asked me to take you outside while she buys you a present she doesn't want you to see." Now, even though I was young, the situation didn't seem right because I just talked to my mom about 20 seconds earlier and had been with her the entire time we were there, so I immediately panicked and ran back to my mom. I didn't say anything at first because I felt also like I might have been upsetting her by not doing what she may or may not have just said to this guy. So I just waited if she would say anything. Of course, she said nothing, and we just kept shopping as usual. As we were checking out like 10 minutes later, I saw that same guy walking out of the store with a little boy around my age. It wasn't until years later that I told my parents this story. They were mortified, but not a day goes by that I don't wonder if I witnessed someone being kidnapped and did nothing to stop it. Wasn't really a kid, but when I was 16, I was helping out on my uncle's farm during the summer as means to earn money for a car, which I planned on buying when I got home. I would use their ATV as a means of getting around since it was mostly gravel roads and muddy paths around the fields and property. One morning, I took the ATV to my uncle's parents' place to get a combine and other machinery ready when I spotted a pickup truck still running parked on the shoulder next to one of the fields that we were in the process of harvesting. Thinking it was one of my uncle's friends, I pulled up next to the truck and saw this fairly heavy-set middle-aged man slumped over in the driver's seat. I tapped on the window and got no response and stepped it up until I was banging on the door with my fist. Even though I had a cell phone on me, coverage was non-existent where I was, so I sped down the road to my uncle's parents' place and called 911. 15 minutes later, a patrol car pulls up, and the officer breaks open the window to let himself in. That's when the smell of feces and piss hit everyone present, and it was enough to make me vomit. An ambulance shows up 5 minutes later, but it's too late. The guy's DOA. The officer took down my statement and wished me a good day. A couple of months later, I got a phone call from my cousin, and it turned out the guy I found was a major heroin addict from a couple of counties over. From what the police gathered, he'd been driving, strung out for a few hours before stopping right in front of my uncle's field to shoot up for what would be his last time. Don't do heroin, kids. In primary school, one kid lured another kid into the bathroom, then beat the shit out of him, held him down on the floor, and shoved his D in his bleeding boy's mouth. This was maybe grade 3. Whoa. Years later, I found out that kid was being beaten and molested by his stepfather for years before. Think ended up in foster care. Probably the time my dad chopped off one of his fingers with a chainsaw at his birthday party to get a rise out of his buddies. That one effed me up. We had a few home invasion situations also. Dad was involved with organized crime and was taken away by some very bad dudes, and we didn't think we'd ever see him again. And that still F's with my head too. Crazy story how he was able to get out of that one. Dad has a lot of crazy stories. One of our first Halloweens in our new town when I was 8, we had 2 people covered head to toe in purple and black cloth who barged in and sat down on our couch. My dad was at work at his new job, and me, my sister, and my mom were home alone. We couldn't see who they were. They handed us a card asking us to guess who they were, and if we got it right, in 3 tries, they'd unmask. We didn't get it right. They got up and they walked out. My mom was freaked enough that she called Dad, said what happened, and asked him to come home. To this day, we don't know who they were. I have my suspicions. I've since found it's a thing called bell snickling. Look, it may sound like a little bit of innocent fun, and there was probably a time when there was more innocence in the world, but cynic in me makes me think that this is a recipe for disaster in certain neighborhoods and houses, so oh well. Mid-90s, I was at a cottage in northern Ontario at a family get-together thing. It was evening, and the kids were sent to bed. None of us slept, or even tried to. We played games and chatted. I was looking out the window at a forest around us when I saw something more in the trees. I watched as a tall, man-like figure strode through the trees. It turned its head in my direction, and I ducked out of his view. I don't know if it was looking at me or just turned its head. I'd never forgotten how it moved. It just felt eerie. Not really a kid, late teen, an old friend of mine had been experimenting with chemistry of gunpowder. Just was making little paper bags filled with his makeshift gunpowder. I don't think much of it at the time. Fast forward a year. He's lying in snow in front of his school door after the bomb he made went off prematurely. Injured 8 kids, but got most of the damage himself. Lost a leg to the explosion. Apparently, his plan was to leave the bomb in the assembly hall during the morning call and kill with it as many people as possible. Now facing 12 years in jail just because no casualties. My family, me, my 2 older brothers, my parents, and a cousin were heading to St. Louis to see the Arch and go to Six Flags. I was 9 at the time. I was sitting in the very back of our minivan, playing my Game Boy, when I heard my mom gasp. I looked out the window to see traffic on the eastbound lanes of the highway at a complete standstill. There was a brown Jeep Wrangler that had collided with a minivan just like ours. Both vehicles were smoking and were a tangled mess of metal. The occupants of the Jeep were laying in the highway and mangled. The man and the woman looked like rag dolls that had their limbs torn behind their backs and their heads twisted around. The occupants of the van were still inside and not moving. Kids, just like me from what I saw. Blood running down the side of the vehicle. The only first responder on scene was a cop frantically running to place sheets on the bodies of the couple in the highway before more onlookers could see them. We used to go boating a lot when I was a kid. I was about 10 and I remember a group of people just down the shore from us had sweet Wave Blaster 2s. Wave Blaster people were riding very recklessly, getting too close and trying to spray each other, etc. It was only a matter of time before we heard the crash. Just a loud thud and crunch. Some boaters next to us rushed out to the middle of the lake and came back to shore with a dead woman on the swim deck of their boat. I remember someone doing CPR on her for a really long time. Life Flight showed up and landed on the beach soon after. Then they shut down the engines, and then the sheriff showed up. We took my uncle's boat out and helped recover the crashed Wave Blaster from the middle of the lake. It was half sunken and had a humongous hole in the side of it. The collision must have been incredibly hard. Walking home from a community movie night in the park, a drunk guy with a duffel bag in hand was walking behind us as we walked back to the car. I was maybe 10, and we were stopped at a crosswalk when he caught up and asked if I was interested in baseball cards, saying that the bag was full of them. My mother gently told him, no thank you. He just was like, okay, just in case, and set it down and cut through a parking lot toward their tracks. Mother called the cops, and shortly after, we heard the train horn go off more times than normal. Police came and asked some questions and checked the bag. Sure enough, aside from some empty beer cans, it was in fact full of baseball cards. Weirdest experience as a kid, and We never did find out what happened to that guy. This wasn't so much witnessed as it was experienced. The whole thing felt like a fever dream, and I wasn't sure it even happened until I asked my parents about it almost 20 years later. They confirmed it to be true, but had otherwise been hoping I didn't remember it. So when I was around 4 or so, I woke in the middle of the night to my dad angrily screaming. He had two types of angry screaming. One, where he was just in a violent rage and wholly unpredictable, or one of frustration because was either feeling helpless or wronged. It was the latter. I heard my dad saying things like, "I'm going to kill him. I'm going to kill that son of a bitch. Where are my keys?" All the while my mother trying to calm him down. I heard the door to the garage slam and heard my dad's truck peel off into the night. This all took place around midnight. My mom comes into my room and I immediately pretend like I'm sleeping. She's holding the cordless phone in one hand. I remember that distinctly because we only had a rotary phone previously and had just gotten a cordless, and jostling me awake with the other. She speaks to me very gently and tells me she needs me to come with her to my brother's room. I'm not in trouble. She just needs me to come with her to my brother's room. She puts me to bed next to my brother, sits in a small chair, and he had in his room, sets the cordless phone on the nightstand, and tells me to go to sleep. I do. I wake around 3 hours later, near 3 a.m. or so, to the sound of the cordless phone ringing right next to my head. I see my mom had drifted off, and I, being a stupid, thoughtless kid, answered the phone and said, "Hello?" And on the other side of the phone, I hear a super creepy old man's voice say, my grandmother's name. "I know you're in there," in this sickening sing-song kind of way. My mom rouses from her sleep, yanks the phone from my hand, says something along the lines of, "You ever call here again and you're a dead man," and yells to my father downstairs. She tells my brother and I to just stay in the room and do not come out unless she or my father comes in first. I hear my father ranting and raving and angrily screaming, but I'll never forget hearing legitimate worry and compassion in his voice that I'd never heard before at the time. This goes on for about 10 minutes until it dies down. Me and my brother don't even speak and hardly even look at each other because we're afraid to even make the slightest noise. We eventually drift off back to sleep. I wake up, and just as the sun is rising to find my mother sitting back in that little chair, she looks much calmer now, is awake, and gives me a slightly forced smile when she sees I've woken up. I ask her if it's okay to go downstairs. She tells me it is, but to be as quiet as possible and to not bother my father. I go downstairs to see my grandmother asleep on the couch, and my dad silently sitting in the rocking chair with a rifle across his lap. Apparently, my grandmother, who lived about an hour away, has a stalker that had recently begun harassing her, calling her late at night and saying things like, "I like that striped shirt you were wearing when you watered the plants today," or "You should wear a sweater when you take out the trash." Things like that to specifically let her know he was watching her daily. So, the ruckus I had originally woken up to was my grandma had called the house to let my mom and dad know that the sick F had called her in the middle of the night yet again, and she couldn't take it anymore. My dad yelling at the "I'm gonna kill him" stuff was in reference to this guy, obviously. So it turns out my father drove all the way to my granny's house, brought her back to ours. Now I have to mention that we lived in a very rural area. I grew up on an island, and odds were if you lived there, your father built your house. So when this MFer called the house at 3 a.m., the instance in which I answered, there were good odds that he was within proximity of our home. How he got our home phone number is beyond me. This was 1990, 91, and even though the phone books were a resource, my mother had been married for over 10 years at the time and had a different last name than my grandmother. So I don't know how this dude connected the dots and found out where we lived. Unfortunately, the closure to this story is not very thrilling, in that what ended up happening is that my father put in a police report, Grandma stayed with us for another week, and nothing ultimately came of it. But I swear to God, that old effer's spooky voice still haunts me. I have nightmares about it sometimes.